Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting forward, past the incense clouds of Egypt and into a colder, stranger world. The fires are smaller now. The rooms are wooden instead of stone, and the air smells not of perfume, but of wet earth, candle grease, and too much righteousness. Welcome to Colonial America, a place where sin was everyone's favorite topic, and nobody ever stopped talking about it. It's an odd thing, how people who left Europe to escape religious persecution immediately began persecuting each other. It's almost comforting, in a tragic way. Human consistency at its finest. In this land of pilgrim hats and nervous sermons, religion wasn't just a private affair. It was a full-time community sport. Everyone watched everyone else for signs of grace or damnation. Because in early America, scandal wasn't an accident. It was an ecosystem. Imagine a small New England village, around the year 1690. The air is damp, and so is everyone's mood. The meeting house sits in the center, doubling as both church and town hall, a wooden box where souls and taxes were discussed with equal suspicion. Every Sunday, the townsfolk filed in. Men on one side, women on the other, children squirming somewhere in between. The preacher stood at a plain pulpit, his voice slow, his theology slower. He preached of sin, damnation, and the faint, flickering hope of salvation, preferably achievable through strict obedience to him. This was Calvinist America, where people believed most souls were already predestined for hell, but tried to act cheerful about it. You couldn't dance. You couldn't play cards. You definitely couldn't smile too much, because if you look happy, someone might assume you were enjoying yourself, and that was suspicious. And yet, under all that gray cloth and scripture, something very human kept simmering. Desire, greed, curiosity. The old sins refused to die. No matter how many sermons you threw at them, they simply went underground, and that's where the real stories begin. Let's drift gently to Boston, mid-17th century, a city of wooden houses, cold winds, and stricter morals than gravity. It's easy to romanticize the Puritans as stern but noble pioneers, faces framed by white collars and conviction. In reality, most of them were just tired people trying to survive while being judged by their neighbors for how tired they looked. They lived in fear of two great enemies, the devil and gossip, and they weren't sure which was worse. The colonies were small, gossip was fast, and privacy was a myth. If you sneezed, 3 people wrote about it in their diaries. If you were seen laughing too loudly, it might be brought up in Sunday's sermon. And if you sinned, or were rumored to have sinned, well, then you became the community's entertainment for months. The most popular scandals involved ministers, which makes sense. They were the celebrities of their time, standing in elevated pulpits with everyone's spiritual credit in their hands. The problem was, power and repression are a dangerous mix. A few preachers started confusing divine inspiration with other forms of excitement. Take, for example, the case of Reverend Henry Smith of Wethersfield, one of New England's earliest ministers. By all accounts, he was devout, eloquent, and just slightly unhinged, a useful combination in colonial clergy. But the townsfolk began whispering that he treated his female parishioners with too much personal concern. One letter accused him of overmuch visitation, which in Puritan terms was practically a scandalous headline. Eventually, the congregation turned on him. Smith claimed he was the victim of slander and witchcraft. The townspeople claimed he was the devil's tool. Everyone prayed, everyone accused, and the whole affair ended the way most colonial scandals did, with no clear truth, only exhaustion. That was the pattern of the age. Someone sinned, someone denied, and everyone else wrote about it in moral panic. But the most famous scandals were rarely about the flesh. They were about pride, the sin that Puritans could never quite purge, no matter how many sermons they wrote about humility. One of the strangest examples came from Anne Hutchinson, a midwife and mother of 15 who somehow managed to irritate the entire male establishment of Massachusetts Bay. Her crime was simple. She talked too much about grace. She began hosting small meetings in her home, discussing sermons and theology, and, Weiss, suggesting that people could experience God directly, without the approval of ministers. It sounds harmless, even progressive, but in 1637, it was heresy of the most inconvenient sort. Hutchinson's popularity grew. Men and women came to hear her speak. She challenged ministers publicly, quoted scripture back at them, and smiled while doing it, always a bad sign in Puritan politics. Eventually, the colony decided she was too dangerous. They put her on trial for antinomianism, a word that means believing in grace so much you stop caring about rules. Her judges were outraged not just by her theology, but by her calmness. She answered questions too well. They accused her of having delusions of direct revelation. She said God spoke to her heart. They called that evidence of Satan. In the end, she was banished, not for sin, but for the far greater colonial crime of making the men look foolish. And yet, the scandal didn't end there, and Hutchinson became a symbol of everything the Puritans feared: female intellect, private belief, and the possibility that God might prefer whispering to women instead of ministers, which, frankly, seems entirely in character for him. Let's drift forward a few decades to Salem, 1692. You know where this is going. The most famous moral meltdown in American history, the witch trials, a fever dream of religion, rumor, and adolescent boredom that turned an entire town into a courtroom. We tend to picture Salem as a singular eruption of madness, but it wasn't unique. Every colony had its share of witchcraft scares. Salem was simply the one that kept better records. It began quietly, as these things always do. A few girls in the minister's household started behaving oddly, trembling, convulsing, claiming invisible hands pinched them, the kind of thing modern medicine might diagnose as stress or epilepsy. But in colonial Massachusetts, there was only one diagnosis: Satan was recruiting. Soon, half the town was accusing the other half. Goody Proctor, goody nice, even the minister's own critics. If someone didn't like you, they called you a witch. If you defended yourself too well, that was proof you were possessed. It was the perfect closed system. Secular logic with a body count. What made Salem so particularly American was its blend of righteousness and spectacle. People came to trials as if to a sermon. They wept loudly, gasped dramatically, and occasionally fainted for effect. Executions were moral theater, and when the dust settled, everyone wrote pious apologies, the colonial equivalent of saying mistakes were made. The underlying scandal, though, wasn't witchcraft. It was hypocrisy. The trials revealed what the colonies didn't want to admit, that beneath the polished piety, there was greed, fear, and the constant hum of social resentment. Land disputes, inheritance quarrels, grudges disguised as revelations. God may have been in heaven, but property lines were eternal. And of course, not all religious scandal was public. Some of it was deeply, deliciously private. By the 18th century, the colonies had grown wealthier, a bit looser, and much more creative in their moral failings. The First Great Awakening, that wave of evangelical revival sweeping through the 1730s and 1740s, brought fiery new preachers who specialized in guilt. They shouted, they wept, they promised salvation between sobs. It was religion as theater again, but this time, portable. They could pitch a tent anywhere and save souls by the dozen, and occasionally, seduce them too. One of the era's more memorable figures was Reverend James Davenport, an itinerant preacher known for setting things on fire, literally. He once burned piles of sinful possessions, including wigs, fancy clothes, and musical instruments. In the heat of his zeal, he even threw his own pants into the flames, shouting that they were too worldly. When asked later if he regretted it, he said, "No, for the Spirit moved me." Which, given the draft, seems plausible. Other ministers were less flamboyant but more scandalous. Diaries and court records reveal numerous cases of improper familiarity between pastors and their female parishioners. The language is always polite, but the meaning is clay. Apparently, nothing ignited religious passion like proximity to a man convinced he could save your soul personally. And then, there were the sects. Colonial America was a playground for religious experimentation. Every eccentric with a Bible and an opinion could start a movement. Some were harmless mystics, others, less so. In Pennsylvania, the Ephrata cloister took celibacy so seriously that its members slept on wooden benches, convinced comfort was the gateway to hell. They sang hauntingly beautiful hymns about purity, which might explain why they were always recruiting. Loneliness makes for great choirs. A few miles away, the Shakers danced their way to holiness. Literally, their ecstatic worship involved trembling, shaking, and spontaneous outbursts of divine energy, which, to their credit, looked more fun than most Puritan services. They also believed in gender equality and communal property. Naturally, everyone else called them heretics. But the colony's greatest religious scandal came not from cults or witches, but from the slow realization that nobody actually agreed on anything. The Puritans split into Congregationalists. The Anglicans argued with Presbyterians. Quakers infuriated everyone by refusing to fight. And by the late 1700s, the Founding Fathers quietly decided the only way to keep peace was to separate church and state, essentially institutionalizing exhaustion. Because after 2 centuries of preaching, judging, and witch-hunting, America finally admitted it might be better if people handled their own salvation privately. Yet even in its scandals, early America was strangely sincere. People sinned and repented with equal enthusiasm. They truly believed the world was a moral battlefield, that every flirtation, every argument, every unexplained illness had cosmic significance. It made life meaningful, in a constant, exhausting way. And beneath the fear and hypocrisy, there was something touching, a desire for purity that never quite worked, but never disappeared either. Even the worst offenders, the gossiping ministers, the lusty preachers, the self-righteous accusers, all thought they were helping God tidy up the neighborhood. They just didn't realize how messy it would get. So tonight, as the fire dies low and the world outside your window grows quiet, picture colonial America not as a place of clear morals, but of contradictions. A land where the people fled tyranny, only to rebuild it in miniature, where they punished sin but secretly envied it, where every scandal was half tragedy, half sermon. Somewhere in that wooden meeting house, another minister is still preaching about temptation, another parishioner is still whispering about him, and somewhere outside, someone is quietly laughing into their sleeve. Because, of course, the scandal never really ends. It just changes its wardrobe.